Good evening, everyone. I would like to call the meeting of the City Council of University City to order at 6:30 on January 27th, 2020. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Carr,
Present.
Councilmember Mann, Councilmember Hales,
Here.
Councilmember Kusick,
Here.
Here.
Mayor Crowe.
Here. Thank you very much. And before we move to the agenda, just very quickly, in the past 2 weeks, we lost one of our stalwart citizens, Henry Lupke, and not only was Henry a great neighbor to many people, but anytime you have someone who served on the University City Civil Service Board for 34 years, I think that probably deserves quite a commendation to him. So Henry's wife still lives here in University City, as does his daughter, Carrie Hermeling. So I wanted to just let that be known that we thank Henry for his service, and we hope that all goes well for Judy and the rest of the family. You have before you the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? I heard none during the study session. So is there a motion to approve? Motion to approve by Mr. Kusick. Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. McMahon. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. You have before you a proclamation celebrating the University City Children's Center's 50th anniversary. Is there a motion to approve? Motion by Mr. Smotherson, seconded by Mr. McMahon. Any discussion? Hearing none. Those in favor? I apologize.
I would just like to make a personal comment about the proclamation. UCCC, as I've always called it, came out when a family member of one of my children needed some real help, and they stepped up and really helped our family. It's a great organization, great people, and I would have been remiss not to just mention that personal connection and how wonderful they were for us. So I'm glad to see that.
There's a motion before you and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. You have before you the January 13th regular meeting minutes of the City Council. Is there a motion to approve? Motion by Mr. Kusick, seconded by Mr. Hales. Any discussion?
I'll be abstaining. I was absent.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. I would like to appoint Will Andrews to the Historic Preservation Commission to fill the spot by Esley Hamilton. Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Kusick. Is there a discussion? Hearing none. Oh, yes.
I'm sorry, Mayor. I didn't push it fast enough. Yes, I would like to thank Mr. Hamilton for his many years of service on the Historic Preservation Commission. He will be missed, but he was a constant source of valuable information.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Mr. Hales.
I would like to nominate Bart Stewart for reappointment to the Traffic Commission.
Is there a second? Seconded by Ms. Carr. Is there discussion? Hearing none. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. We have no swearing in. We have citizen participation. For those of you who have not been here before, there are sign-up sheets over by the door that you can fill out with your name and address and what item you'd like to speak on, or just a non-agenda item. When you come to the podium, please give your name and address. Each speaker is limited to 5 minutes. The first set of citizen comments is limited to 15 minutes, and then the second section will be at the end of the meeting. Our first request to speak is Carl Sabota. I'm sorry, could you hit the button at the bottom in the center? There, thank you.
My name is Carl Sabolka. I live at 1421 Coolidge in University City. I am addressing the council about a pack van, a moving storage box that is sitting in front of 1467 Coolidge Drive. It's been there 8 months since June of 2019. It's been there 8 months. Nobody goes in or out of this van. It is there only to advertise who it's for. It's for pack van. It's measures. I measured it tonight. It measures 9 feet wide. It's 8 feet high, and it's 21 feet long. It has no wheels on it. It just sits there advertising. Nobody goes in or out of it. I know this because I live a few doors down from it. There is a fire hydrant the next house over. It is 2 houses from the corner of Kemplin and Coolidge, and it obstructs the view of the intersection, and it's an eyesore, and I very much object to it. To be sitting there that long, I've talked with Joe Blizzard, who I'd like to commend the council for hiring. He is a much improvement over the previous inspectors. It doesn't excuse the previous inspectors that the city has hired, but Joe has been a very helpful and responsive employee. And I've talked to him about this van on several occasions, and nothing is allowed to be done. I just think it's terrible when everybody else has to have inspections and valid license plates and current plates, and this thing sits there, no plates, advertising. It does nothing. It does nothing except advertise. And I just would like to thank you all for allowing me to address you, and I would like to have somebody do something. I don't know what. Just move it. That's all I want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will have someone from the city staff contact you. Thank you. Our next request to speak is Mr. Tom Jennings.
Thank you. Tom Jennings, 7055 Forsyth. I just wanted to comment this morning when I got out of bed. The first thing I did was go to the front window and pull up the shade. And I noticed a young lady pulling up across the street in front of my neighbor's drive. They blocked the whole thing. And I thought, that's odd. She can't park there. Next thing she does, she gets out, took all their trash cans, moved them up just pile them one on front next to the other, got in her car, and then pulled it up and parked. Well, I couldn't do a thing about it. Well, later in the day, as I was driving out, I noticed the trash guy was just right there. So I just stopped my car, and when he stopped there, I walked across to mention it. I said, I'm sorry this thing happens, but I said, you might want to let them know that, they're moving these trash cans. He said, sir, we know it's a problem, but he said, the truth is I do it all the time. And he could not have been nicer. He got out and sorted them all around. And I'm thinking, you know what? We're putting our workers to a little extra effort. And I don't know if there's anything you can do about this, but I just thought I'd bring it up because it was, he was so nice about it. Moved them all around, did everything he could, and kudos to him. But I wish the students wouldn't do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes this portion of the agenda. We have no public hearing. You have before you the consent agenda, gun detection devices. Is there a motion to approve? Motion to approve by Ms. Carr, seconded by Mr. McMahon. Any discussion? Ms. Carr.
So as I looked at this particular issue, I noticed that it is for 1/4 square mile. Can you tell me where that 1/4 square mile is, or have I misinterpreted that?
Chief, would you come and address the Councilmember Carr's question?
You're on.
Good afternoon. The 1/4 square mile it's pretty much consistent with where we had the pilot program at. It's in our most statistical area for the gunshot detections or the gunshot detection reporting of that area. So we're talking pretty much north central, northeast area of the town.
Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Mr. Rose.
Honorable Mayor and council members, on January the 13th, council approved the 2020 legislative platform, which provides guidance to our legislative delegation at both the state and federal level. Tonight, I've invited Mr. Pat Kelly. He is the executive director for the Municipal League of Metro St. Louis, and certainly keeps a close watch on what happens at the state level. So I've invited him to provide us with a legislative update. Mr. Kelly?
Thank you very much, Mayor, Board of Aldermen. It's great to be here this evening. I can tell you from past experience, it's great to have a Board of Aldermen meeting where residents are coming up and complimenting the city, so you should be proud of that. But it is great to be here tonight. As your city administrator, Mr. Rose, mentioned, we adopted our legislative priorities earlier this year, and since the session has started, as usual, some of you might know this, but more than a third of the legislation that is bills that are filed at the state capitol on an annual basis, more than a third, usually impact municipal governments in some way. And unfortunately, most of the time it's in a negative capacity. But this year, being an election year, we are, I have my 8 pages of legislation that we're following, and I hope that you all do get these legislative updates every Friday. If you don't, you should be getting them by email, and if you want to contact the league office, we'll make sure you get them, or we post them to our website every Friday afternoon by about 2 o'clock. So we try to do that to keep all of our elected officials throughout the county as informed as possible. But I wanted to go over some of the pieces of legislation that we're following very closely right now. There's really only a few of them. As I started to say, this is an election year, so there's not as many bills out there that are really impacting local government at this time. So I'll go over a few, and then I'll try to answer any questions if you have them. The first one, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and I'm afraid to comment on because if I say something wrong, the city attorney will correct me, but, and John's been a great help on this legislation over the years, and specifically this bill as well, and that's Senate Bill 526, which is a video franchise fee legislation that was drafted by charter. It had no input by the municipal leagues, either locally or at the state level. It was filed, pre-filed by Senator Emery, and actually we had our first meeting with Senator Emery on this bill actually today. The first hearing for the legislation is on Wednesday at noon. It's my understanding, John, you're going to be there, as well as some other legal counsel that both the county league and the state league we jointly hired, and his name is Bill Ogile. He specializes in telecommunication law for Armstrong Teasdale. He'll be flying in from Denver to also testify at the hearing on Wednesday. So the bill, as I assume most of you know, in its best scenario would reduce video franchise fees for municipalities by a minimum of 75%. And for a city, I'm sorry to say I didn't look at this for University City today, but I would imagine that's probably in excess of $300,000 a year. For a city of your size. So we are adamantly opposed to that legislation, and we're working to either kill it or have it changed to where it goes back to its, what most cities charge is a 5% fee, and there's a few that have 3%, but opposed to basically $1 on the first $12, or $1 on the first $20 is what charter is proposing in this legislation for the average customer. So that's one piece of legislation. Second one, it deals with, it's House Bill 1933, and that's Representative Wyman. We've worked against this legislation the last 2 years, and it's a Missouri Local Government Expenditure Database. And what Representative Wyman would like to have is a database requiring all municipalities to file monthly reports to the state, and then those reports would be uploaded onto a database that residents could go into and look up. It would be basically it's a checkbook. So it would be where every check was written by the city, who the vendor was that it went to, and what it was for, and the amount. The legislation has been changed this year, and it is now, in current form, it is voluntary, and they also did this year include counties. But we didn't take a position on it because what happened last year as it moved through the session when we got it negotiated to this current form, except for the county portion, but that it was voluntary. When it got over to the Senate last year, it was amended to make it so that all cities had to participate. So we didn't take a position. We're going to watch this legislation very closely, but you know, we don't think it's fair. It would be a Hancock amendment if they force every municipality to participate in the program. I will tell you, though, that if you have time and you want to see how this type of program works, if you go to our Google Ohio checkbook, and Ohio has a really neat website. They've done this. It was voluntary. What they found is that it's only been in place for about 3 years, and what they found was by making it voluntary, a lot of people actually ran their campaigns on getting their municipalities or their sewer districts or their school districts. It's open to all political subdivisions in the state of Ohio, and it's been building very quickly. And we believe as a league that that's the way it should be done, either that the city wants to do it or the residents want to do it. In Representative Wyman's bill, it does say that if 5% of the registered voters get a petition together asking for the city to participate in it, then they will have to. So, but if you want to take a look at and see a program that actually works really well, you could take a look at the Ohio checkbook. The other big issue, our primary one, is Wayfair. We are working, there's a number of pieces of legislations that we're supporting, and those legislation all leave the municipalities or give them the ability to collect the internet sales tax or out-of-state sales. There's a number of pieces of legislation, though, that either have some type of rollback within their legislation or put a cap on local sales taxes. Basically, they want to keep it revenue neutral, meaning that we could collect these new taxes, but we'd have to give up taxes someplace else. Some of them are just requiring the state to give taxes back, meaning that they have a reduction in the income tax in the state level to offset the increase in sales tax that the consumers would be paying. So we're supporting primarily Senator Cunningham's bill, which is Senate Bill 529, and also Senate Bill 872, which is Senator Crawford's bill. Senator Crawford's bill came down from the governor's office, and the governor has put certain stipulations in there requiring that the state funds go to a disaster pool for disaster situations that we have in the state so that we have a backup funds for those, as well as paying down the state's debt, and then some of that for infrastructure. And this is just their new taxes coming in from the internet sales or their use taxes. But municipalities and counties and other taxing districts around the state would be left alone. So we're in support of that legislation. And then there's a number of bills, like I said, that have some type of cap or reduction in sales tax in them. Most of those are being filed, a number of them by Senator Koenig here in St. Louis County, as well as a couple of our senators in Jefferson or in St. Charles County. So the two big ones are really the video franchise bill and then Wayfair, what we're working for this year, and then just a couple of these other ones that I mentioned too that we're watching closely. So if I can answer any questions, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Any questions for Mr. Kelly?
Honorable Mayor and council members, I would just like to thank Mr. Kelly for coming and doing the presentation. I think that you know, when you start looking at the reduction of revenues for municipalities, I am hopeful that the legislature keeps in mind that $356,000, that's a couple of firefighters or a couple of police officers that could be impacted. So where I can appreciate the desire to lower the burden that government may place on the private sector, I think that they also have to factor in the services that government is responsible for providing, especially in the area of public safety.
And I would add to that as well. I think the thing that they fail to recognize is that, and St. Louis County is a perfect example of that. You know, 2019, the overall sales in St. Louis County was down 1.5%, our sales tax revenue. Now, in this booming economy, if it's down 1.5%, it's really down about 3%. From where it should be. If you take into account this just shows the impact of internet sales on our local economy. And over the years, that's been building up. So in many instances, the city had to raise taxes in order to offset for that loss in the internet sales tax. So yeah, it's not a new tax as some people would like to make it be. And the reality of it is most of these products, people wouldn't, if it were not for the internet, they would be buying them at local stores. And these are taxes that our residents voted for in order to support and pay for those services that the cities provide for them. So I agree 100%. So thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Can I give one other quick update, just real quick, because I know Alderwoman Carr helped a lot with the Board of Freeholders and collecting signatures. I just give you a real quick update. You probably already know. We're still waiting for St. Louis City to make their appointments to the Board of Freeholders. There's a lot of debate about has the clock started ticking and so forth, but really none of those issues are going to be resolved until they make their appointments. We're hopeful again that it might happen this Friday. That's what we've heard. But if not, we are considering trying to see if we can get some of our state legislators to ask the Attorney General to intervene and see if he can come up with some way of encouraging St. Louis City to at least vote on the nominations from the mayor. So, okay. Well, thank you again. And really, one other comment. Again, this is on our website, and our website is open to the general public. So if the general public really wants to kind of go and see legislation and have some updates, they're more than welcome to go to the league's website. So thank you again. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Rose.
Honorable Mayor and council members, this next item asks council to consider a conditional use permit, PC 19-04. The proposed convenience store at property commonly known as 883 Kingsland Avenue, and I would ask Mr. Cross to present this item.
Oops. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Mayor, City Council, good evening. As Mr. Rose indicated, this applies to a conditional use permit that appeared before the Planning Commission back in August. Specifically, the applicant is seeking to establish and operate a convenience store at that address. The zoning ordinance requires that the Planning Commission consider and ultimately City Council approve a conditional use permit for that type of operation within the industrial commercial zoning district. So as part of the process, they did conduct the public hearing at the Planning Commission. They heard the testimony. The Planning Commission seemed to think that the use itself was appropriate for the site. However, the biggest issue that has come out of it was the parking concerns associated with the property. I think you all know that that property itself has some parking challenges based on the current businesses that are in there. Initially, we looked at it from a standpoint that the use itself had been established in terms of the entire commercial operations and retail businesses within all the suites. And the option was to look at it, is it what we call a non-conforming use, which is quite honestly a fancy term for a grandfathered use. But because they are changing uses, we thought that that would not be the appropriate determination. So we have milled over it a little bit over the last couple months and looked at some individual ways to address it. So basically what has happened is we evaluated the total parking required, and it would require 136 spaces originally if you did not have the remaining 2 suites occupied. We did get an amendment a while back for the nail salon, which we felt like that it was a little bit out of whack. that reduced the parking by approximately 24 spaces. So long story short, in looking at this use, it would require 112 parking spaces. We then further evaluated some of the shared parking ratios associated with the uses within the building and got it down to roughly 101 spaces. Then you have the option to address that it's within 500 feet of a transit station, so we can do another 10% reduction. Long story short with all that, we've got it down where the required parking would be approximately 96 spaces for the use. Where council comes into play on this, in addition to the conditional use permit, is we are asking that there be a reduction approved as part of this conditional use permit of approximately 11%. That would get it down to the 85 spaces that currently are there. And you as a council have the authority to do that in your review provisions to review and ultimately attach conditions to the approval of a conditional use permit. And specifically, you can reduce it up to 20%, but no more than that. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have that are specific to this request, and we're asking for your action on this item.
Thank you, Mayor. My question is, will this continue, if we do vote for the reduction, will it continue if a like business moves in, or will it be discontinued if an unlike business moves in?
Well, you can set that as a condition, because with conditional use permits, if you have another convenience store that comes in, they can continue the same as the prior one if it's a change of ownership. If you have a new business by the current code, that would be a commercial business replacing an existing commercial business, and that would require them to come back and get the CUP prior to doing it. So it wouldn't carry over for an unlike business.
Okay, and then one more quick question. I know that this shopping center is, we're having to consider whether we're going to reduce by 20%, but there still seems to be some square footage in there that is unrented. And so what will happen, and just, it's more of a,
Yeah.
what do you see happening
Well,
at that point?
Yeah, and you're exactly right, and that's the extra space I keep referring to. The numbers we're counting on does not account for the 6 spaces that would be required for the approximate 1,200 square foot empty space that remains. If you were to approve that, you would be coming and asking for an additional 5% reduction, so you would not exceed 16%. So if another retail business comes in, you still have the option to reduce that because it is still underneath that 20%. One of the things that we saw in looking at this, with your parking amendments last year, we put the shared parking ratios in there that worked. I mean, it's a good fit. But the challenge here is, as part of that amendment, there was a provision in there that allowed for multi-tenant buildings having more than 3 tenants to have a 20% reduction in it. 2 tenants or less, it was a 15% reduction. And in your amendment, you added that 25% reduction for existing business, commercial business coming in as existing business. The problem is, and we evaluated that, but the problem with this particular use is the code clearly states if the use is established prior to the adoption of the ordinance. And the 97 ordinance was adopted almost 8 years before this business came in, so the existing building and business wasn't there. That's why we couldn't go that route. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure who was first over here. Mr. Kusick.
Thank you, Mayor. I've got 2 questions. Mr. Cross, this is next to or across from the projected nursing facility that's being built there on the east side of Kingsland. Mm-hmm. Is that facility going to be asking for any of those parking spaces across the street or any of the shared parking, or are they providing all of their required parking?
That development is providing all their required parking per their planned development approval. So they are not, that was not approved, my understanding, that was not approved to utilize shared parking across the street. So the answer is they would not be allowed to do that.
Okay, and then I am assuming that the Planning Commission did hear this back in August, and they said do pass on this as well?
They did hear it back in August, and they recommended a majority approval. However, I do caution, then we were looking at it from a non-conforming parking standpoint, so they haven't heard about the reduction in terms of an official condition of this approval. They do know that there was going to need to be an accepted reduction in the parking as part of the non-conforming approach.
Thank you.
Mr. Smotherson.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question, because I think you're addressing the parking issue, which is obvious with this convenience store going in next to Mi Ranchitos. But my question is, in looking for this address, why is the building addressed Kingsland when not one of those storefronts faces Kingsland? I was looking for the address and then got confused, but not one of those storefronts, not even the laundromat. So I'm just kind of curious about that. That's just my little
Yeah, I mean, we can look into it, but the assumption is when the site plan was approved back in '05, that was the address that was assigned to it. And addressing, yeah, I get it, because I would think you would have the frontage. I mean, when I address things, I would have do it that way, but I can't answer why they did it back then that way.
But that building's been there longer than '05. That building's been there, I've been here since '94.
Well, what happened is, yeah, but in '01 and '02, they started the process of a formal site plan approval, which locked that in as its current use. And then they did a conditional use permit, if I recall, for the laundromat.
No, mine was just the addresses. He was talking about the addresses.
Yeah.
Those addresses were set up probably 40 years ago when that was built.
A lot of times they were probably recorded with the plat and created at that time.
And Mr. Hales.
Thank you. A number of years ago, when I was on the Traffic Commission, there was a proposal that came from the landlord to expand the parking. And I don't know if that went to plan. I don't know, or you're aware of that?
Yeah, it did, and they looked at it, and actually they were looking at it from a standpoint of what we call an impervious surface ratio, where underlying zoning districts, and specifically this one, can only have a certain amount of percentage of the lot covered by impervious surface. I think 70% off the top of my head, and now I think they're like at 75%. They got a approval as part of that site plan approval. One of the things that came up a couple years ago, they did come back for a variance to further increase that to 77% and put some parking to the rear, which drew some concerns by the neighbors that it would be right up on. So, I mean, either way, you'd either be adding impervious surface to accommodate the parking or reducing the parking. And then looking at the history, we just quite honestly thought this was the best approach. And believe me, we're all for businesses accommodating their on-site parking, but I think the beauty of this is, and we all know, the restaurant's what throws it out of whack. I mean, one space for every 75 square feet, well, 66 spaces alone are for the restaurant, and at noon to 1 and 5 to 7 or whatever, and then you do have some extra parking, but we just thought with the impervious surface ratios going up, you have stormwater runoff issues, you have a whole flurry of things that could happen. But the last thing, the beauty of this is, the building was designed at 15,000 square feet, and it actually had a surplus of roughly 8 spaces before the restaurant came in. And the beauty of this is, if the restaurant goes, and it's a great restaurant, but say it went, then the parking's going to automatically be back in whack, because there's nothing from a staff standpoint that we're going to allow anything to go in there that now exceeds that 85 parking that's required for the original site plan.
Okay. I mean, on the one hand, we have a tenant who clearly knows the issue with the parking after going through Plan Commission for CUP. It's safe to say that if this building were to be built today, it would have more parking than it. We're not going to repeat this.
Well, yeah, we shouldn't. The disconnect was the building was scheduled right in its parking. The parking was dead on. Actually, there was an extra 8 spaces. The problem is an occupancy permit allowed for a new business and an expansion of a business that exceeded the parking. the moment it came in. Quite honestly, they should have never been allowed to go in.
Okay, okay, thank you.
They shouldn't have been allowed to go in, meaning which one?
If they were meeting the letter of the intent of the parking regulations, the restaurant should have had to provide additional parking when they came in.
And were they a part of this process at all? Probably not, since they were just a lessee.
Yeah, they're just a lessee.
I think probably all of us have this probably general concern that we all eat there enough that I'm thinking of further complicating the parking problems in that shopping center does not excite me in the slightest. So I'm trying to, and this is the only option that we've got is kind of to let them come in.
Well, I mean, no, I mean, you can deny it. We looked at options of adding additional spaces to the front, just wasn't going to work because of the access and the curb. We looked at shared parking off-site, wasn't going to work. But this is the final, I mean, this is the only option, honestly, at this point for them to continue to use it unless they somehow buy property. And that, I know they've looked into it, but if they buy property and add additional spaces, but they're pretty landlocked. So, I mean, they're sitting with two vacancies until they can get their parking back in line with the, either the restaurant goes or whatever. But obviously, we know the restaurant's the biggest draw there.
Oh, yeah. Restaurant, and then the probably laundromat, I assume, is next. But I really do have to say to my colleagues, the only thing I'm thinking about is how much my phone's going to ring, and my emails are going to get popped with this as the parking in that shopping center just goes from bad to worse. So, Ms. Carr.
Thank you. So, Mr. Cross, during the Plan Commission discussion, we talked about the hours of the convenience store versus the hours of the restaurant, which I think all of my colleagues are concerned about it. I think Councilmember Cusick and I are even more concerned because it's our ward and because the parking goes into a residential area. So can you address the hours, what hours the convenience store anticipated would be their high traffic time in opposition to Mi Ranchito's high
I got the impression, well, if I recall correctly, they were talking, their busy hours they thought would be maybe mid-afternoon and earlier in the evening. Now, that's a fine line because if it's 1 o'clock, then they're right there when all the other traffic's there. If it's 2:30, that's one of the gaps that they have. I don't recall them specifically stating what their peak hours were, but I think I got the impression they were going to do mid-afternoon and early evenings was going to be, I think early evenings is going to be the biggest challenge, to be honest, around 6 o'clock with the dinner crowd and them. I mean, one of the things we could do, we could go back and revent that with the Planning Commission. If that is an option, council always has to kick it back to PC to do some more discovery or whatever you want to call it to kind of clarify it and touch base.
Thank you.
Mr. Cusick.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd just like to add one comment that this is a retail area and the owners of the property do have other vacant portions of that building. And I think it would be incumbent upon them to be able to demonstrate that in the future, if they want us to allow any more businesses to go in there, that they're going to have to compensate and come up with a very creative way to address the parking situation. And I don't know that I would want to open up any kind of retail shop in that area with the understanding that there's a very successful restaurant right next door to me.
Right.
So I think that may have some bearing in the conversation. Thank you.
Is there a way for us to, I mean, I don't want to impede, I really hate to impede someone opening their business. I think that's always a challenge, but this one just smacks of, I think if you're the landlord, you're probably still happier with the tenant that you've got than the one you're going to get, probably, because that tenant's probably been there at least 25 years. But I think we've got to come up with a parking solution here. I mean, by the way, and I firmly agree that it's from 11 to 1 and I'd say, 5:30 till 8 o'clock probably, depending on when the WashU students are in town or not. I think that's probably all fair. But I would sure like to see something a little bit more robust. And again, I think about is that I don't know that their employees park in the lot. Do they park across the street? Do they park around the corner? I mean, I know when I drove by Vernon the other day, all the construction guys had all the spots on Vernon taken, so I get that. You've got the old Pete Suresave grassy lot across the way. I end up parking usually in front of the houses, and it doesn't bother me, but I have a feeling it may bother the residents every now and then. And I just, unless you tell me that we're really squashing a complete deal, I would sure like to have this come back to us with some method forward, because I think we're asking to get our heads handed to us based on the parking situation there.
Well, and the applicants and the owner, they know we're trying to look at options, and I mean, I don't think it's out of bounds to take it back and say, hey, we need to look at it a little more. We're just at our point where with current provisions, that's really the final option for them. And the thought was, let's just get it out and see where we go and go from there. I agree. I mean, there's some decisions that the landlord's going to have to make in the long term.
I mean, I don't know. Do we have more street parking nearby on Kingsland even? I mean, I don't know that we do. It's, and I really, again, I do not enjoy slowing this thing down. And if my colleagues from the Second Ward are all for this, and I still may vote no. I have to say this because I cannot get my hands around adding more vehicular traffic to that parking lot. And by the way, that's horrible for the landlord for me to say that. I understand that.
And that's why we were very specific that this is site-specific, because we agree we don't want to set a precedent in reducing parking.
Correct.
Our goal is to allow them to use the highest and best use of the property.
Yep.
Unfortunately, we've all been handed sins of the past. Is the best way to put it.
I think Mr. Cusick was first.
I'd just like to add, Mayor, that I think the owners of the property have been in conversation with some of the other property owners, and they're not willing to share any of their parking. I think the business just to the south of them has plenty of parking that they don't utilize in the evening, but they've indicated that they're not interested in using that. So they really are landlocked. Ms. Carr.
I guess the question is, we have a landlord that has about 2,400 square feet. Is that unleased?
Yeah, it's 1,800 for this one and 1,200 for the other.
All right, so a little bit more than about 3,000.
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea, of course, would be that we'd like to have not empty storefronts. And the pressure actually comes from the restaurant because it is so successful and everybody wants to eat there. I don't know, because I have sat in all these meetings, and the Plan Commission has literally turned the thing inside out and upside down and been unable to come to any resolution, even with the reduction for the hair place. It's just simply not going to happen. So and I don't like pushing the parking out on the street of my constituents, because they do want to park in front of their homes. If you look at their homes, most of them don't have garages or driveways or things like that. So they need that parking, and Vernon is a very busy street. I don't know what the answer. I mean, honestly, we're all scratching our heads. On one hand, I don't want to see the empty storefronts. On the other hand, I don't want the parking pushed out into there is no place to push the parking, literally. So I understand your reluctance. I share that same reluctance in approving something where the parking further stresses the region. I just don't know what to do.
Okay, folks, is there any more discussion? Mr. Kusick?
I would like to ask Mr. Cross if he thinks it would be possible to go back to the requester and see if they might have some ideas on something else to do to share our concerns. If
I'd
that's
be
a
happy to.
possibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because again, like Councilmember Carr says, we don't want empty storefronts in our community and our area, but at the same time, those people in Vernon are already pretty upset about the parking and.
Sure. I'd be happy to do so. I don't think it's out of.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Kusick, I believe that through this process, the Planning Commission as well as staff have looked at, reviewed every alternative, every option that we could come up with, and that included engaging the leasee as well as the property owner to try and identify a way of enhancing the parking in that area and not exacerbating the existing problem. I believe that's what's being proposed by staff, what's being recommended by staff and the Planning Commission is the best alternative that we could identify for this particular leasee. I believe that if this is approved, it would be an understanding of the property owner that his other unit would not be able to be occupied. Because if the mayor and council agree to this, there's no way that they could add an additional business into that area.
Do we know whether the neighboring properties was that they were just, they just said no, or it was just not economically feasible because of the rates they wanted to charge?
My understanding is that they just couldn't make it work. I didn't get clarification. I know the neighborhood association was working with them on that little stretch that has the butterfly, they were talking about a butterfly garden. I just think the logistics wasn't going to work for them. I don't think it was going to give them enough spaces for the bang for the buck and get them into compliance anyway. So my understanding is it just wasn't going to solve their problem.
Mr. Hales?
What's the scope of the convenience store? Are they selling food to go, or is it?
They're going to have a little deli in there. They're a little unique. Actually, when they first came in, we kind of teetered, what are they? Are they a deli? Are they a convenience store? And the reason that was important, because one drove the conditional use permit process to get all this out. The other one would have been an administrative approval. And thank goodness, because the staff, I don't know if I would have, I mean, honestly, that's a tough call. Because an administrative approval, you don't have the opportunity for all these conditions. So in reviewing the ordinance, there's a definition in there, and I always go to the definitions because they clean up a lot of stuff. There's a definition in there of a convenience store, and it's any type of business that has home goods that is under 3,000 square feet. That's what separates it from a grocery store or a Dollar General. And that fell under that classification of the convenience store that also had, they are going to sell, they're going to have a little deli in there as well. But that's how they got classified as a convenience store.
Okay. You know, I agree this is a challenging one. But honestly, I think you could take one of the other businesses that's already there out, and on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, or even during the day, that lot's already going to be full or overflowing just because of the restaurant. So, you know, in my mind, we have a property owner who knows there's a problem. We have a potential tenant who wants to open a business who knows there's already a problem, and they're willing to move forward on that. You know, I think my biggest concern would be people parking in front of people's homes. That would be at the top of my list. I don't know how many people are going to just be bent on going to that convenience store but I know there are a lot of people that are bent on going to Mi Ranchito. So I guess my question is just how much worse can it possibly be when the lot's already full during hugely peak hours already? It just, you can't add more cars to a lot that's already full, and it's full a lot.
Yeah, no matter what you do, you got a real-world parking problem. I mean, even if they add 5 spaces, you're still going to have, at those hours, you're going to have a real parking problem.
Mr. Kusick and then Mr. Mulligan.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to ask Mr. Rose and I guess Mr. Croston, you said that your staff and departments have looked at this and you're recommending that we approve this cup. And could I understand why you would recommend it, please?
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Kusick, we are recommending this because in an effort not to hinder economic development in that area, the impact that it would have on the business, the business owner as well as the property owner. That is why we have worked very hard trying to identify options that would not cure, but at least mitigate some of the challenges that an additional business would have. As a part of the statement that I made just earlier, I believe that the property owner would be clear that there's no way that another business, if you decide to approve this one, there's no way that another business would be able to go into that lot.
Mr. Mulligan.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to pick up on some of the points, I certainly agree with the city manager on the amount of time and resources that have been spent on this since last August. There has been quite a bit of legal analysis, staff analysis, meetings. There was in 2017 an application for a variance on the maximum site coverage. Mr. Cross mentioned that. I was not involved in that. I think it was before my time, that time. So what that would have done, the current site coverage, as I understand, is about 74%. The code sets it at 70, but it was given an additional 4% back in connection with the site plan in 2001, 2002. Under the conditional use permit process, you can go up to 77%. That really doesn't help out all that much in terms of getting parking spaces. The owner recognized that there was a parking problem and knew that that needed to be addressed, hence the application for the variance. That would have taken it to 90%. That's what he sought. So if you go from 74 to 90%, you're going to have quite a few more parking spaces. That application was withdrawn. I'm not exactly sure why. I think legally there's certainly a question as to whether it would meet the criteria for granting a variance. So perhaps that factored into it. But certainly if you were to take some of the additional space and convert it to parking, and not that there would be no consequence as a result of that, but physically I think that could be done. That would require either a change in the code or granting the variance. So if council's interested in exploring that, certainly we can take a look at amending the code to, under this particular circumstance, to authorize an increase in the maximum site coverage to a higher number that would get you more parking spaces. The other option I think Mr. Cross mentioned that he looked at was using neighboring properties. Now, the property to the south is what was mentioned during the Plan Commission meeting. My understanding is there could be a surplus parking situation there. However, I was told that the owner of that business was not interested in allowing use of some of those surplus spaces for this particular business. So absent some business nearby, some other location nearby that you can have an off-site parking arrangement, and our code allows that, but, you know, you've got to have an easement or some other right to use that property. You know, you really don't have any options other than continuing with the vacant 3,000 square feet, or if, as Mr. Cross said, if the restaurant decides to leave, and you get a retail business in there, then your parking numbers go way down. You know, I can't think of any other way we can really go with this. That's where we are with it.
And the parking problem is not really, I assume, employee parking at all.
No, I don't believe it is. Actually, the one thing, and I do see occasionally with them when I drive, is I think the employees will park around behind the back of the building in kind of the fire lane.
Yep.
Which is a no-no. But yeah, they're not taking up the spaces in the front.
Well, we have a motion before us. We've had discussion. Are we ready to take a vote? Did I miss? I didn't have a motion? Oh, I apologize. I thought I did. Thank you for keeping me honest, Laurite. Was there a motion to approve? Motion to approve by Mr. Hales. Is there a second? Second by Ms. Carr. Would you like a roll call or would you like a voice vote? Doesn't matter to me. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Those opposed, nay. 2 nays, I believe, Laurite. Maybe. I think Mr. Smothers sent me. I could be wrong. Anyway, by the way, this is a tough one. There really is. This one, there's not a good answer. To take it to 90% after we just had the Stormwater Task Force meeting doesn't quite seem like it would be very good for us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move to unfinished business. Madam Clerk, can we have the second reading of Bill number 9398?
An ordinance amending section 120.940 of Municipal Code of the City of University Business District Advisory Commission by amending subsection 8.1 thereof relating to membership.
Thank you. May we have the third reading?
An ordinance amending section 120.940 of Municipal Code of the City of University City relating to the Loop Special Business District Advisory Commission by amending subsection 8.1 thereof relating to membership.
Thank you very much. Is there a motion to approve? Motion by Ms. Carr. Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Cusick. Is there discussion? Ms. Carr.
Thank you, Mayor. As I had mentioned in early December when this was first put on the agenda, this is not so much a change to the ordinance as it is a clarification. We are clarifying essentially 1980s language and an intent from 1980s and updating it to 2020. And so essentially what it does is it allows those people who are subject to the taxes and are not in arrears to represent themselves and not have those who are not subject to the taxes represent them. But it is not a narrowing necessarily or an elimination. I've heard discussion about this being not inclusive or exclusive. I think that's a red herring. To be on a board, you have some criteria. First of all, you have to be appointed. Second of all, you have to possibly meet some criteria. For instance, you have to be a resident of University City. On some boards, you have to have an architecture degree or an engineering degree, or you have to be an attorney or an architect. So it's not unusual. since this is one of our boards, to also specify that those people who generate, or who are taxed and who generate the funds, be the ones that make the decisions about how the funds are to be generated. And in 1980s, that was thought to be those people who owned property and those people who ran a retail business, meaning that they got a state license, et cetera. Over time, not by virtue of the council, it has been reinterpreted, and in 2015, the city decided to issue some licenses, some business licenses to 4 churches and 1 attorney. Federal statutes would tell you that churches are not businesses. And so why that was done, it's not clear to me. And with regard to certain protected classes of professionals, doctors, lawyers, and essentially any kind of doctors, CPAs, teachers, the state regulates them, and I'm not sure why we would be issuing a business license to someone who doesn't have to pay for one, and regulated by the city. So again, one attorney. But more importantly, it's an issue about having representation of the people who are subject to the circumstances or subject to taxation, to have representation of their own. So it's just simply a clarification that that you have to be subject to those taxes, and that you not be in arrears. Here's where a little bit is added. Because most of the ownership is no longer personal, in other words, one person owns it, our code talks about an individual. A corporation is not an individual. A partnership is not an individual. So again, to update it, you have to take into account how can those people legitimately be represented on this board, because in fact those property owners are taxed 85 cents per $100 of evaluation, of assessed value, excuse me. So this simply updates it and says that each of those corporations or partnerships who own property, and that's most of them, can have an individual appointed to the advisory commission if that individual is formally affiliated with the owner, and the owner is subject to the taxes and not in arrears, but that person must be designated by the property owning group. And that's not much more, again, than clarifying it. So for those property owners or those non-individuals, if they wish to designate someone who doesn't have a business license, they're perfectly free to do that. So that actually allows for inclusion and expansion. So it's not saying that if you're an attorney and you are officially designated, or you're a doctor and you're officially designated by one of these property owning groups, you certainly are eligible to serve. We've had some discussions about what we want out of the governance of the Loop Special Business District. This only relates peripherally in my mind, because we haven't talked about, in this ordinance, we haven't talked about caps, we haven't talked about elections, we haven't talked about any of those things. We're only talking about definitions. And as you heard, the Director of Planning and Zoning has said that he goes back to the definition because that's the cleanest way to do it. And so this isn't about eliminating opportunities or about making it more exclusive. It simply is about clarifying the definitions of who is eligible and who is not. And if the council decides that they would like to expand on the governance, that is another peripheral issue, or maybe it's a central issue. It sounded like it might be a central issue, but this ordinance is only a clarification of the definitions of those persons, those individuals who would be eligible to serve by virtue of the fact that they represent a business that is subject to the tax and not arrears, or that they are designated by the property owning entity and in writing, and so all of those goals, even a not-for-profit can decide that they would be willing to pay the taxes and still be eligible to serve. So there's no eliminating those avenues. Even if you are incorporated as a not-for-profit, if you choose to be subject to the taxes, then you too could qualify. I think I've covered just about everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hales.
Thank you. First, I don't take issue with anything that Councilmember Carr said. I really don't take issue with anything in the ordinance. As Councilmember McMahon said Saturday morning at our retreat when we talked about this LSBD board for in excess, I think, of 2 hours, it really was her and Councilmember Cusick's bringing this issue to the forefront and to the attention. And what followed on Saturday was a really robust and deliberative discussion that went on and on and on. But out of it came, I thought, a great deal of clarity. So I want to share with my colleagues what I've already said to Councilmember Carr, that I would rather this proceed sort of holistically looking at all the issues and coming back to us. I think the city manager wanted, and city attorney, we're going to go to the board at the next meeting, perhaps, and come back within 45 days. I know that is not what Councilmember Carr would like, but I wanted to share my opinion on this with everyone and see what anybody else has to say about it.
Mr. Cusick.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to also talk about the retreat that we had on Saturday, and we brought up the LSBD and went on for 2 hours about that. And I was thankful for Mr. Rose and his ideas about how to proceed and how to move forward with the LSBD. Having attended every meeting of the LSBD since I've been on this council, minus one meeting, I really think that they need a clear roadmap and direction on where they need to be going in terms of one of the boards that we are responsible for, as they are a quasi-government district. We are ultimately responsible to them, and they're to us. I would like to also add that the passing of this ordinance is just a clarification of what we already had, as Ms. Carr has stated, and that what's going to happen in the next time that Mr. Rose and the mayor can attend the meeting it will be actionable items that are down the road. But at this time, I think that we need this clarification because I think they need this direction now. Having been to many of their meetings, they feel like they're in limbo about who is going to be their new board members, and I think that they need this now to move on. And I would like to say something briefly, two more things real quick. In terms of not-for-profits, certainly, like Councilmember Carr said, if there are not-for-profits that feel very strongly that they want to be on the LSBD board, let them get on the tax rolls. There are many not-for-profits that do not pay taxes. We'll let them pay taxes, and we'll let them be on the board. I'd love to have their tax dollars. And to that end, we have a very large not-for-profit organization in our midst. And would we then, if we allow not-for-profit organizations on the LSBD board, would we then open the door to allow them to move in and take over the LSBD, and it would just the Loop Special Business District would just be the arm of just one large not-for-profit entity? And I think that is an area that we don't want to go into. And then I don't see this ordinance as being exclusive. I questioned Mr. Rose on Saturday morning about what he meant when he used the word inclusion about people going to the LSBD board and the meetings. And those meetings are all open to the public. Anyone is welcome to come in and present something to the LSBD board, their ideas, and talk about issues, go to the board meetings. The LSBD has subcommittees. They have marketing subcommittee. They have event subcommittees. Individuals are more than welcome to come to those meetings if they so choose. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. For those of you, I think only one person in the audience, I think maybe was, except for the directors, was with us on a Saturday. We did have a robust conversation. Just to say it was robust, maybe even an understatement to spend that much time on this issue. I too would like for this to be a part of the overall revamping of the LSBD and how they operate, and I think that's a more appropriate way to move forward. So, you know, I'm not sure what the plan is for this evening, but I would sure welcome the opportunity for this to be part of a larger plan. Ms. Carr.
So I think I should probably address at least two colleagues' opinions of kicking the can down the road. We've been kicking the can down the road for well over a year. We've held 2 meetings with the LSBD, and we've had multiple meetings without the LSBD, and each time we have delivered to the city manager our desire. He even showed up to the LSBD meeting to talk to them, and he was treated really rather rudely. He was told that they know what's best, and that was essentially it. And although we had talked to them about having an executive director that actually planned events or actually met the requirements of the ordinance, they essentially killed it by not having a second. It's, you know, we have been able to bring all of our other boards and commissions into compliance, except for this one. This one has a rather large budget. This one has a controlling personality who wants to get their members on the board so that it ceases to function as an advisory board to us. There are, in my opinion, misappropriation of spending of funds. We couldn't reconcile their account, even though almost a year is there. We have our staff there. We have legal, we have financial, and we have economic development there because it appears they don't have the infrastructure to do this. Now, I'm not addressing any of those issues or the game of let me get all of my tenants on the board. But what I am saying is that although we as a council have had plenty of opportunity to do it, we haven't been very successful. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't undertake it, and I'm putting "we" in quotes. It will not happen while I'm sitting here. And I don't know if any of you will have interest in doing it, because quite frankly, my partner and colleague is really the only ones who show up to those meetings. So while we seem to be the ones that have experienced what's going on, and people write me and tell me it's, you know, that they have ceased to go to meetings, I can tell you who shows up to meetings. The people from the city, a person from WashU, people from the East Loop, and the people who are on the board, and Audrey Jones from Mannequins in the Loop. Bless her, honestly. But no one else is showing up. When I first started going to these meetings 8 years ago, the place was packed. They don't see that the LSBD operates for them. You know, they've just simply given up. I have a letter here that says, you know, I've given up. So I think that those are all things that we intend to address. But if you'll just look at some of the things that have come to us, just that keep getting pushed further out, there's no timeline. You cannot guarantee me a timeline that this is going to happen. there's going to be a snowstorm, or there's going to be a lack of a quorum, or we can't put together the legislation fast enough, there's another priority. And this ordinance is not addressing those broader problems that we discussed. But this ordinance is a first step in clarifying who is a member. I'm not talking about, whether the mayor accepts nominations from the LSBD. I mean, I think that the elephant in the room, as I said on Saturday, is the appointment process. The way that they've been allowed and encouraged to hold elections, and they think that that's the nominating thing. Be that as it may, I hope you as a council do address these issues. I'm here to address this one issue. And so, so it will be up to, you to decide whether you want to address this one issue, because this issue was not covered in that list that we talked about when we talked about governance. We talked about, if I remember correctly, we talked about adding diversity, but I didn't see a definition of diversity. Is that a diversity of opinion, a diversity of businesses? We talked about caps. We talked about allowing the board to make some kind of a recommendation to us, and we talked about whether we wanted, and I'm not sure whether we wanted a not-for-profit on there or not. Some of those things, the city attorney told us, could be handled through the bylaws, and some of those things could also be handled through our council rules. I know how long it takes to address council rules. My point here really is that this ordinance was in no way covered on that list, and it is still, we still need a definition for who is eligible to serve on the board. We still need that definition, and while I know while I have granted postponements for some people that ask for postponements, this was brought to you in December, and I have had about that much discussion with my colleagues in terms of, their questions about it. In fact, I've had to call my colleagues and say, do you have any questions? So, I'm not so sure this is clear. I'm not willing at this point to lay it all out. But this issue of membership, the definition of the membership, the clarification from 1980s terms to 2020 terms was not covered at all in that list. Because if it was, show me where it was. Does anybody have that? No one? Okay. So I would humbly ask that you address this issue of membership and then go on to address the broader issues of what you want out of the board. This is ours. I mean, this particular issue of who is a membership is ours. It's not for the board to select, to decide who they want for members. That was done in 1980. And then I think there was an update in the early 90s as well. This is about clarifying the language only. It is not exclusive. It allows for mechanisms for people to serve who may not be on there. And by the way, there is one major not-for-profit who does pay the taxes, at least the assessed taxes, and taxes on sales, and that is Craft Alliance, the one not-for-profit that's always said, well, Craft Alliance would be able to serve. At this point, Craft Alliance can serve because they are subject to those taxes, and even though they are clearly a not-for-profit. So those issues are kind of red herrings, just as I think wanting to, lump it all together, but this definition is not in there. It wasn't on that whiteboard on Saturday. I looked to see if somewhere that was an issue, and it wasn't. So I'm willing to go with whatever my colleagues say, but ultimately, you will take the responsibility for the success not only of the board, but the success of the loop. It will be your responsibility.
Mr. Smotherson.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just trying to, with this ordinance, I'm just really trying to get a better understanding of how this is going to go into effect. So my question to the city manager or to the city attorney is, if this passes, how would this be applied? When will it be applied? You know, it's just to get a better understanding of how that affects things, if passed.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Smotherson, as far as the application of it, it will become effective immediately after it is approved. But I do think that it would be worthwhile for our city attorney to identify at least an overview of what this ordinance actually achieves. During the retreat, I believe we had a very brief discussion about whether the mayor and council desired, as a part of the governance structure for the LSPD, to have not-for-profit organizations sit on the board, as well as doctors and so forth. Those that are restricted, I think, by state statute as far as it involves providing a business license. But I do think it's important for you to understand that approval of this ordinance may not necessarily prevent those individuals from actually sitting on the LSPD. But I think it's important for probably our city attorney to highlight that particular issue.
This bill, as Councilmember Carr said, clarifies the existing language in the ordinance. It states that in order to be appointed to the Loop Special Business District Advisory Commission, that the individual must either own real property or have a licensed business that's subject to the additional tax in the municipal code. That is in 120.910. That tax is 85 cents per $100 of assessed value. And then on the business license tax or fee, it's an additional 50% over the current fee or tax for that particular business. And so the current code does not say in so many words that that the individual has to be subject to the license tax or fee. The state law that applies to and governs cities states that certain occupations are not subject to a business license tax or fee. There are very few actually, but minister is one, a teacher or professor. You have lawyers, dentists, doctors, physicians, and chiropractors, optometrists, and CPAs, and that's a Christian Science practitioner. That's pretty much it. So the state has taken away a city's authority to impose a license fee or tax on those occupations. So they don't pay any fee. We can't make them pay any license fee. Now, you certainly could have a lawyer who owns property in the Loop, in the Special Business District, and is not exempt, unless that lawyer were incorporated as a not-for-profit, but which is possible. But most lawyers have a for-profit business, so that business then would be subject to no license fee under state law, but would be subject to real property taxes. So that lawyer would be eligible as a property owner paying property taxes to serve on the commission under the ordinance. The current code speaks in terms of a municipally licensed business, so that raises a question of what if you were to give a business grant a business license to a lawyer or a church, but not impose a fee, which would be consistent with state law. And then you have to look at what was the intent of the council back in 1980 when they passed it. Was it to allow a church or license or doctor to be licensed and serve, or do you look at the ordinance as a whole, Section 120.91 in particular, which imposes this additional 50% license tax or fee and 85 cents per $100 assessed valuation, and said this is what the council intended, that it intended for those who are paying to be eligible as a municipally licensed business or owner of property in the district. So this clarifies that what the intent of the council is, that you have to be subject to that tax. Now, the second major clarification with this bill is with respect to the owner of real property. I think the practice over the years has been when a corporation, an LLC, owns property that somebody serves for that corporation. They serve on the LSPD Advisory Commission. The ordinance currently doesn't say that. It just says an individual. An individual, is going to be a person, a human being who would be on this commission. And so what this does, this bill clarifies that when property is owned by a corporation, basically an entity, that entity may designate an individual who's affiliated with it, such as an officer would be an example, or a manager, but somebody who is officially attached or connection. That's the definition of affiliation. So if you have somebody who's officially attached or connected to that particular entity, that entity may designate a person and say, I want this individual, could be a lawyer, doctor, priest, and anybody, to basically serve as my authorized representative and be eligible for appointment to the commission. So it clarifies kind of what the practice has been, and it does open up to the extent that there was any question about whether a lawyer, doctor, or other individual with that profession could serve. It certainly says you can. So generally there is no exclusion as far as any profession in this bill. So that's what we have before you tonight in terms of the two major clarifications.
Okay, and then one last question is that, because I guess to be more specific about this, if this passes tonight, what effect does it have on the current board right now?
It would have, as far as the eligibility to continue serving, I think that it would have no impact, and that my understanding is that the current individuals, or at least those whose terms have not expired, would not be excluded under this or prior, or the existing version, or the one if council chooses to pass this. I would need to I would need to look at that specifically before I could say that's my definitive legal opinion. That's my understanding, but I would probably need to visit with the finance director to pull the business licenses and the real estate records of the 6 of the 9 whose terms have not expired.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Smotherson, if the mayor and council elect to pass this and it has an impact on the existing board, those that are already seated, they were seated up under, I would say, clearly different legislation. So I would certainly recommend that those individuals be grandfathered and that their terms be allowed, and they would be allowed to serve out the remainder of their term.
And if I may, under the Missouri Constitution, any person holding office, and this is an office, it's a form of office, that person may continue to serve until the successor is appointed and sworn. So you would, those individuals, and it'd be up to the mayor and council as far as when they should be replaced.
Mr. McMahon.
Thank you. So I think as Mr. Hales said, I get the impetus behind the change in language. It seems like what's being said is that the current practice almost mirrors what this language will result in. Because if I'm reading it and understanding the conversation, there would be a certain, very probably small portion of folks that might not be eligible unless they took extra steps. Meaning, if I own property, if I don't own property in the Loop Special Business District, and I am not, so I'm not subject to the tax because I'm an owner, so I'm not qualified. If I then have a business in the Loop Special Business District that is not subject to a license fee, then I, on my own, am not eligible. I would need to, if I wanted to serve, I would need to be affiliated with a corporation in order for that corporation to say, I would like you to do that. So one of the questions I have is, when it says formally affiliated, would it be an individual that then has a contract with one of these corporations?
Not necessarily. Officially attached or connection is the dictionary definition of affiliation, and that's what we would apply. So I think what we would do, we would look at the relationship that the individual has. You know, what kind of contract is it? Is this person simply, I think the person has to be simply more than just a designee, somebody off the street. You have to have that affiliation. Manager, supervisor,
an employee,
director.
I mean, how far, I mean, because at some point, how far down, and then that's the other question is why, if the corporation has to act through individuals, corporations just don't speak on their own, so they're going to have to designate somebody. So correct. If the managers and directors of a corporation believed that this one individual could really help, they can't nominate them or designate them because they're not an officer or a director. So, I mean, is that what it's saying?
No, I don't think you have to be an officer or director. I think there's probably an agency relationship that could be established. And I think if a corporation had somebody in mind who they wanted, I think there's a way they could structure the relationship to satisfy it. At the end of the day, it will be up to the council to determine whether that affiliation is significant enough to justify appointing that person.
So there'd still be some of this moving target kind of, somebody might want somebody would try to move it in a way that maybe doesn't fit with our view or the next council's view. of how that's going to be going. So I get that, and I think I can work with what we've got there. I think there's the bigger fish to fry that we've been discussing that have come up during this discussion, and which confuses me because we keep saying this isn't about that, but then we have a lot of discussion and all these points come up about, well, we're not going to do caps, or we're going to do caps, or we're going to do this. One of the things that was left off the list, which I raised, was I don't think the LSBD has authority to have elections, which muddies the waters on this. That was on the list. So it was really a specific thing that had meat to it, and those discussions would have to be had. And that relates to these decisions on who can serve, because it all gets intertwined in that whole thing together. And I think one of the reasons this didn't get to the list is because there was a lot of folks that, when we talked about it at the meeting, it's not like this was ignored. It came up, we talked about it, there was support. There were people that said, I get this, I understand it. So we weren't and it was going to be talked about in 2 days. We were going to be here on Monday. So it wasn't put on the list because it's already been out there. So that seems to just, to me, it's missing the point. I don't see that an action today changes the practice that's already in existence for a practical purpose, that a delay wouldn't really change anything today. Nobody would be off, no one would move, and it would still be the same practice, so we can take care of this at another time. So I'm in support of these things, but I'm also in support of working, as Mr. Hale said, in a more holistic manner with some of these really other big issues, and getting them done, and not delaying it to a point where we don't take action. Thank you.
Ms. Carr.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, for whatever it's worth, there is something, and it actually came in here, in the minutes, which I'm assuming that you all read, and it's that not only did they propose someone, but this someone has been elected, and those have been submitted, and so it's not as though are you going to just leave them sitting there? I mean, again, the elephant in the room is the mayor makes the appointments, and for several years we've been relying on these elections. And while you are talking about not making this retroactive, all of the letters that we received from emails that we received on behalf of the chair of the LSBD, because he was actually encouraged to rally his troops while other troops were not being rallied, or even consulted to see if they were interested. All of them said, we've already made our election, this is retroactive. I mean, for whatever that is, you can leave those people sitting there as they are, and that's fine, with one exception. You are one member short on that LSBD board. Now, it doesn't normally bother us to let a commission go with one member short, sometimes for up to a year. But this is a little bit different in terms of the fact that they have a budget to put together, that there is an issue of contention right now. I understand that you might prefer to put this in, but the fact of the matter is this is not included in that list. Mr. Rose labeled the list 1, 2, 3, 4, I think. This was not among those 4 things that he labeled. You're not really considering those things. You're considering things that you talked about caps and diversity, and all of those things are a little bit touchy-feely. This is a definition, and that was not included in that list. So are we up here now saying that we would like to include that in the list, because I haven't heard that. I haven't heard that. So, for whatever this is, if we're not too concerned about defining this, we still haven't got a definition. We still haven't got an operative definition. And this might or might not come up, because this is actually a change to the ordinance. These words change the ordinance, they clarify it. What you're talking about is you're going to set some council rule parameters. They don't change the ordinance in any way, unless you want to write an ordinance. And in order to do that, you've got to find some time to work through the legal, and then you've got to bring it here, and maybe your colleagues will kick that can down the road too, but it won't, my guess is it won't be a smooth transition. In the meantime, there is a problem, a very real problem that we need to address, and that is one of membership definition. And so if I might, I'd like to read you a couple of things in the minutes. It just says, it says here, Joe noted that he had stuffed and mailed the ballots. There was then, he also proposed at this meeting, this is November 12th, and making amendment to the bylaws currently defines members at large as any individual or entity owning property or operating a municipally licensed business within the boundaries of the district. He recommended inclusion of not-for-profit entities. Now, this is the 12th, and this is, I've been working on this other for quite a while longer, because it was clear to me that what we needed were some definitions, some boundaries, some explanation for what was going on. Joe has represented, or Mr. Edwards has represented, that these elections determine the people serving on the board, and they don't. These elections are not binding. But it really, for whatever it was, that's not anywhere in any of the ordinances. It is in their bylaws that they hold an election and how. And then Mr. Patterson stated that under the current definition, Mr. Rome may not be eligible to be a candidate for the board position. So they already knew going into this election that, that there was some question about eligibility, and they decided to proceed. After considerable discussion, it was decided to let the results unfold regarding the board member election and let the city council make the final determination. So, coincidentally, my and Tim's, and I said it the wrong way, Tim's and my ordinance comes out, and suddenly we hear from these letters that this was it was retroactive, it was discriminatory, it was exclusive, any number of other things that that were said, none of which, as I said before, are all red herrings. So for whatever this is, yes, you have a big job, and I'm going to guess that even when you put this together, you're still not going to get compliance. I mean, you have to think of the personalities. You are still not going to get compliance. This is an amendment to the ordinance that clearly states, not what we put in our council rules, or we tell them that they can or cannot put in their bylaws. This is real, and it's now, and I have said even in these minutes that it will not affect the people currently serving. You can't make law retroactive. So the people currently serving who do not, one person who does not qualify can serve out the rest of his term. But there's no guarantee that he would be nominated again under any circumstances. So to have them fight for that really indicates that they expected him to continue. I mean, that's how it came across, that they expected him to continue. This is, again, at least one council member asked me for a delay last time, and I granted it. And at least what passed was a month and a half, and I didn't hear a lot of discussion. And I know that some of this is to calm the waters, but I think the right thing to do is to clarify this part of the ordinance, and then whatever else you seek to do, and I say you because I don't expect to be around here by the time you get to it or finish, no matter what kind of promises you make. I've seen deadlines slip, and not for negligence, but just for the way that things work. So whatever else doesn't look like it is going to be a change to the ordinance. In fact, the chairperson has wanted to talk to our legal department because he has input into how this should actually read. I'm not sure he should necessarily have input. Why don't we hold an open meeting for everybody in University City? Because honestly, we all have an interest in the success of the loop. This is truly, truly about defining, clarifying that one word, eligible for membership, or that one phrase, eligible for membership. It's nothing more. The rest, I applaud you for wanting to take it up, but it was not mentioned in that list. It was not added. It never was intended to be added. In fact, I think most of you expected me to back off. That was the expectation that was conveyed to me, that there would be something better out there. So I'm actually hoping, I'm actually hoping that you will consider this clarification with the seriousness with which it is offered, and that you will then undertake the hard work of making this commission come into compliance with our code by whatever other means you seek, but saying that somehow this can be addressed at the same time. I don't see it. I don't see you expressed an intent on Saturday, and I don't see you really expressing an intent now. And I would hope that you would be very serious about this, because that is our major economic engine, and we have sat here doing little to nothing for over a year. Here's the things that we have done. The city manager has said that legal, financial, and economic development will intervene. Not intervene, that's the wrong word, will assist, will go in to assist. He's also put forward an executive director or a manager, which they defined the terms, but again, when push came to shove, it was controlled. No, we wouldn't make a second to doing that, because we want to take that money and put it into the East Loop. Please remember that the Del Mar Loop name does not belong to us. If you want to look in the Parkview Gardens plan, what you're going to find is that the Del Mar Loop is any place within 1/2 mile of the trolley. WashU wrote that report. If you look in the retail plan that they published in 2011, it is any place within 1/2 mile of the trolley. And yet, the Parkview Gardens plan says that we must build density in order to support the trolley. Boy, that's kind of backwards. So I guess what I'm saying is we had the name Del Mar Loop since the early 1900s, but it really isn't ours anymore. This is our downtown. I'm not saying we shouldn't work with the East. I'm not saying that there aren't plenty of opportunities, but the way this is going, and the reason I bring this up is that the president of this organization, which is a board that is advisory to us, takes the opposite opinion that this area should be joined together, should be overseen by a 353 corporation with the rights to exercise eminent domain and issue TIFs, which we would ultimately be responsible for. Is that, that's something that you will have to address. I mean, you will have to decide. But this ordinance also provides for removing people that don't behave as stewards of this board and the city, in a sense. So, so I applaud you for wanting to take on the larger task, but I think this is a task at hand tonight, right now, and if you turn it down, you're essentially kicking the can down the road, at least for this part, the definition, because there was not 1, 2, 3, 4 didn't talk about how we're going to define the membership. In fact, we talked about whether we should expand that membership. And I can't even remember whether we decided that we were going to expand it or not. So for whatever it was, if it wasn't clear for me, and excuse me for being a little bit braggadocio here, if it wasn't clear to me, I'm surprised that it was very clear to you. So again, I would urge you to vote for this and then undertake the broader issues, because I think that that is what needs to be done here. And doing that, then, and ignoring that, then I and others will hold you responsible for any of the continuing difficulties that we have. But I hope that instead you will see that this is a responsibility that I'm asking you to undertake, and to look seriously at an organization that most of you haven't paid attention to for, you haven't shown up to the meetings. I don't know that you've read the minutes or even tried to follow up with Tim or me. So I don't know if there's anything further left to say, but I think there is.
I would like to say something before I recognize Mr. Hales. I don't believe there's a need for 3 or 4 members of council to show up at an LSPD meeting. I do not believe that in the slightest. We have 2 members who go religiously, and I don't know that we have other folks who go to other meetings any more so, but unless I'm missing it, I don't think that that is anything out of the ordinary. Mr. Hales.
I tried to make some points. So in my mind, on Saturday, this ordinance clearly was a piece of this. While it didn't make it onto the whiteboard, and I had to leave at the very tail end of that discussion and then came back, but the impression I had was that as a group, we kind of found a lot of consensus, and this ordinance addresses a definition and addresses eligibility, but much of the discussion that we had also addressed eligibility. It addressed limitations to eligibility. It addressed ownership. It addressed a member of this council potentially being a liaison. So that's just my understanding where I'm coming from on it. I don't have a problem holding off the appointments until all of these issues get resolved, personally. And then I also don't believe that all of this gets covered in council rules. I think there are pretty significant changes that will require an ordinance relating to some of the issues that we discussed. And that said, I don't know if I misheard or misinterpreted, but I think we all, I certainly did, spoke rather impassioned about some of the issues and frustrations that I had with this issue related to the appointment process, related to the intent behind the ordinance, like, I feel like we agree or agreed on the what, and we're arguing over the how. And it's probably a healthy thing to do, but I think certainly if I inferred that, you know, we weren't, or I wasn't taking that seriously, or that wasn't significant, or that, you know, there's no desire to kick the can here. I don't know who has a desire, but that out of that meeting came a way more robust discussion than we had. So I really don't want to have an argument ongoing about this evening. This is an area where, you know, no two people can ever agree 100% of the time, or even 75% of the time. But our difference is about the how and not the what.
So there's a motion before us that is to take up this matter. There's a motion and a second. Is there any other activity? Hearing none. Mr. McMahon.
I'm going to make a motion to table this discussion until, I think Jeff mentioned 45 days for 45 days.
I don't think we get to table. I think we get to postpone.
Postpone.
Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Smotherson. Is there discussion?
Can you clarify what postponing this discussion is? Is it this ordinance, or is it this broader, I mean,
Well, I think the motion is about the ordinance.
The item on the agenda is the ordinance.
Correct.
so you would be bringing the ordinance back in 45 days, essentially?
Yes.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed? 4 ayes, 2 nays, Larit. This matter is postponed. We can move now to new business. Who would like to introduce Bill number 9399? Mr. Smotherson. May we have the first reading?
An ordinance fixing the compensation to be paid to city officials and employees as enumerated herein from and after its passage, and repealing ordinance number 7109.
Thank you very much. May we now move on to Bill number 9400. May we have an introduction by Mr. Smotherson. May we have the first reading?
An ordinance providing for the reimbursement of city officials and employees for expenses incurred by them in operating their own vehicles in connection with their positions, and repealing ordinance number 6847.
Thank you very much. We'll now move forward to council reports and businesses. Is there any member of council who would like to speak during this section of the agenda? Hearing none, we have no further citizen comment. Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. Mr. Cusick.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess this is a question that I have for Mr. Rose. The Historic Preservation Commission has had several meetings with the developers that want to do the development at the old Delmar Harvard area. And I know that they had gone back to Mr. Cross, and I spoke with Mr. Cross, I think, the other day about it, but has there been any development on possible charrette or anything like that, so that, because the developers are under a time crunch, I believe, and is there an update that we'll be giving them? Because I've been asked by constituents and people in the neighborhood for updates on this, if there's going to be any meetings planned in the near future.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Cusick, based upon the discussions and discussion at the Planning Commission level and several emails that have been distributed, as well as social media, I think the intention is Mr. Cross is going to approach the Historic Preservation Commission and ask that they conduct some sort of a public input process, likely a charrette. So that, I don't anticipate will delay the project much, longer than what it would otherwise experience going through our development process, but that seems to be an important component to have residents having input into the design. Is that accurate? Come on. Okay, that's fine.
Are we good, or? We're good, I think.
Yeah. That's fine, it's accurate.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other, no citizen comments, council comments? Ms. Carr?
So I'm looking at my calendar, and I have a question for both, I think for the city manager. So 45 days is the 12th of March. We have just decided to wait to the 12th of March. And the next city council meeting would be the 23rd. So so for a clarification, can somebody tell me how that works if 45 days finishes on the 12th of March?
Certainly, John can get back to us, but Stephen?
I would assume by the 12th of March, I would move to put it on the agenda for the next meeting. And that would bring us forth to within 45 days of bringing it back, or I'm assuming I could probably even do it earlier.
Okay, the next meeting is actually the 23rd.
Whichever the next is after 45 days.
Mr. Smotherson?
Thank you, Mayor Crow. Well, it looks like I don't have a point in saying what I was going to say, because I was going to welcome Pastor Middleton here, but he just left, so that ended. Pastor Middleton is the pastor of City of Life Church, and I just wanted to welcome here and make sure everybody recognized the fact that he was here at our council meeting. Thank you.
Mr. Cusick?
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I sort of have an observation or a question, or I'm not really sure what it is, but an observation. Mr. Rose driving here this evening, I happened to drive down Delmar from the city limits, and I noticed on the middle of in both lanes in Delmar, going down the middle of the roads, in the roads are these tracks, and all these wires hanging overhead. And it's my understanding that last week, at the end of last week, BICE State kind of said that they weren't going to do anything about the trolley. And I was wondering if we have heard anything official yet about what will be happening with that, and if we are going to be looking at a construction phase of repairing our roads, and if you have anything that you've heard as of yet. I realize this is putting you on the spot, and you may just say no comment, but that's fine.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Cusick, I have not received any contact from the Loop Transportation District regarding what their next steps will be. I would suspect it's too early to tell at this point. I don't believe that they've had an opportunity since the bi-state meeting to actually meet and have a discussion about a pathway forward. So once they meet and have determined what their next steps will be, if they don't reach out to me, then I will reach out to them to start the dialogue about what's going to happen. I'll just leave it at that.
Anything else? Hearing nothing else coming before the body, we stand adjourned.